Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're a bit behind schedule, but now it's time to start the seminar with the title Language as a Tool for Breaking the Gender Binary. My name is påverkas, and I'm a gender equality, diversity, and equal conditions strategist at KTH Royal Institute of Technology here in Stockholm. My pronouns are they, them. Welcome to everyone here sitting in the room. Welcome also to people following via the live stream. And the theme for Stockholm Pride as a whole is the key to freedom. And here at this seminar, we'll discuss how language can limit and exclude people, but also broaden horizons, which is a theme that I think fits very well with the overall theme. Today, we'll have two short presentations on current research, followed by discussion and the opportunity to ask questions. I'm just going to say something quickly about Academic Pride, which is the organizer. Academic Pride is a collaboration around Stockholm Pride between several of Stockholm's institutions of higher education and their associated student unions. The purpose of Academic Pride is to highlight the importance of LGBTQI+ issues in higher education, both when it comes to research and education, but also when it comes to creating inclusive work and study environments for all of us who are active at universities. The organizers of Academic Pride varies a bit from year to year. This year it's Stockholm University, the Stockholm University Student Union, and the Rainbows Association at Stockholm University, Karolinska Institutet and Medicinska föreningens LGBTQ Association Karolinska, the Stockholm School of Economics and the Student Association at the Stockholm School of Economics, the Swedish Royal Cross University College, and then KTH Royal Institute of Technology, which is also coordinating at Academic Pride this year, and our student union's LGBTQ+ organization, Spectrum. I'd also want to give a huge thanks to my colleagues in Academic Pride and everyone who has been involved in organizing this seminar. But the real stars of today are our speakers, Ellie van Berkom from Stockholm University and Amanda Klusing from Lund University, who will now give their short presentations. Please save any questions you might have until the discussion after both of the presentations, and we'll take them then. And with that, I'll give the floor to Ellie.
Thank you so much to Stockholm Pride and Academic Pride for inviting me and us to talk. It's really, really exciting, actually. So as Rose said, I'm a PhD student at Stockholm University. My topic is experimental psychology, and in there I'm really focusing on face perception, and doing really what I'm doing is doing experiments on people and getting to see how we can get people to categorize others not as man or woman. So I call it beyond the binary. So for this short talk, I'm going to start by going maybe what feels like a detour through the field of face perception and kind of the broader issues of measurement in psychology and science really in general. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I've done. So to start off with, face perception, really that's a field of psychology that tries to examine what happens when we see another person's face. And this is really important for the brain to do because everyone has a face and it's one of the body parts you can guarantee is not going to be covered. So there's potentially a lot of information in the face. And how the brain kind of extracts that information is a huge topic of study. And one of the reasons why this is important is that, one, the brain is pretty good at doing this. Like, we can look at a face and get a pretty good view of what that person is. It's not perfect, but it's not terrible either. It's like better than chance anyway. And one of the first things that we extract from a person is group membership. So age, this is social group membership. Age, race, also gender. And this is kind of where I'm focusing and where also just a ton of research has been done. But what I think is a problem is that this has really been done from a very binary gender perspective. So kind of what I'm doing is kind of trying to broaden this view and see, like, again, like, can people can spontaneously categorize others beyond the binary gender? So before I go into that, though, I just want to zoom out a little bit and talk about measurement. So there's kind of a naive, I don't want to say naive, but a scientific view of measurement that holds that there's an objective reality, and then there's us, the scientists, or the people who are doing the measurement. And any quality of an object, like length, height, speed, that's just an inherent property of that object, and then it's unproblematic to measure it. This is not a view that I hold. I think that measurement is actually way more complicated, because when we're measuring something, we're not just finding a property of it. We're actually co-creating that property with that object. So if I'm measuring a height, it's not just that I don't know, these two fingers have 5 centimeters apart. They're actually, like, I have to take a ruler and I have to actually, like, create the concept of the 5 centimeters. So measurement isn't an uncomplicated thing. The how is really important. The tools that you use are really important. Even who you are to do the measurement is actually really, really important. And this becomes especially relevant when we're measuring the behaviors of humans, where it's not just a passive object, but actually sort of agentic or agents. We're measuring people with agency. And of course, kind of a prime example of the complexity is when you're measuring gender. So the way that gender usually is measured in face perception is these 2 ways that I've shown you here. So either you look at a face and you're saying, is that a man or a woman? That's the item that's the slide on the left. Or is it masculine or feminine? And so obviously I don't need to tell you why this is. I don't need to tell this crowd why this is not good. But I think what a lot of scientists don't realize is by doing this, you're not just like neutrally measuring the world. You're actually like sending a worldview to people that there are 2 genders, and masculinity and femininity are opposites, and if you're more feminine, that means automatically that you're less feminine. More masculine means automatically that you're less feminine. So what, like, people haven't really kind of examined what is the effect of doing this. So those are kind of the 2 strands of my research. So one, if you're measuring perceived gender in a very binary way, how does that shape your results? And second, can we also, while we're doing this, can we also get people to be more receptive to the idea of non-binary identities, or what we call them making a beyond binary categorization, which is just not categorizing or saying that's a face is non-binary. So now I'm going to talk a little bit what I've done to do this. So I've done a couple of experiments where people come in or to the web. This is online. They come into the internet and they see this picture here, and they get to describe it. The purpose of this experiment is to kind of coach them to the idea of non-binary gender. And so the way we do that is they have to describe this as good as they can, and we tell them to standardize the results. You have to use the pronoun hen, or hun, or han. And then we can compare participants who used hen, the Swedish they, to participants who used han, and say how open are they to categorizing others as beyond binary. And I've done this twice now. And so one of the ways I've done this is just by including more categories. So here we have this is the same as we saw before, the same slide, but you have beyond the options of man, woman, you have the option to say non-binary, that's in Swedish, or you have the option to say I don't know. And I mean, you could quibble and say what does a non-binary person look like? But at the same time, what does a woman look like? And what we're doing here is just giving more people more options. So this is one way we've done it. We're just explicitly giving people more options to categorize. And then in another version of the experiment that we did, we kind of did this implicitly. So here in this version, they're seeing 6 faces, and then they have to say, how many of the faces do you think are women, and how many faces do you think are men? And so here, you could also not be like, oh, this person, I don't know. It could be, anybody could look like anything. You could say 0, 0 on both of those. So in both of these experiments, you have the option to not categorize people, but in one option you have it explicitly, you have it written out, and here you kind of have it implicitly. And the reason why we have these other options are just as like basically as cover to like not get people suspicious. So what did we find? I'm going to show you the results now. First, of just what the effect of what happens when you what are the effects of different ways of measuring perceived gender. So here is the main results. So on these two different bars, they represent the 2 experiments. So multiple responses, that's the first one where you have the explicit option to categorize as beyond the binary. And here, binary responses, that's what I call the one where we're counting. And proportion of respondents, so that's just how many of the respondents. So it can go from 0 to 1, or you can also think of it as percentages, 0 to 100. And then these colors. So here you see how many of the participants made any number of categorizations beyond the binary. And really what we see here is that when you're giving the people the option to make more categorizations, about half of participants take that option. So about half of participants categorize a face as either I don't know or non-binary. Whereas when all you have is binary response options, about a quarter did that. So here we see actually a huge difference of the way we're measuring, kind of like ostensibly the same thing, but just the fact of phrasing the question a different way has really massively impacted what we've got. And then for the second part of the experiment, which is how does using hen make people more likely to categorize a person as beyond binary? So here we had just the effect of question, and now I'm going to show you what happened based on the description task that I showed you first with a figure. And these effects are not so big. So what you have here is these are the different comparisons. So what is the difference between using hen and using hun? What is the difference between using hen and using han? And control means you don't use any pronoun at all. You're just describing it neutrally. Here, on the x-axis here, you just have how much more likely are you to categorize a face as beyond binary. And what these error bars shows is basically the uncertainty in the measurement. So what we found here is that compared to people who use han pronoun, you're a little bit more likely to categorize a face as beyond binary and, oops, sorry. Sorry, guys. But actually, there's just a lot of uncertainty here. So maybe hen makes people more likely to categorize the faces beyond binary. It looks like maybe probably even, but also unsure. So again, just summarizing it. So really, the main finding here is that the way you phrase a question has a huge impact. And then obviously, I mean, I use hen as a non-binary pronoun, so I think it's a really important pronoun to have. But in this case, we're not actually sure how big the effect is on making, or just like seeing a face and categorizing it as either, I don't know, or non-binary or anything other than a binary. All right, that's all I have to say for now.
There we go. Better? Yes. Excellent. Thank you. I can say again so everybody can hear it, for introducing the topic. So I'm going to continue a little bit on the same topic, but also switching a little bit to a more workplace focused application sort of this effective phrasing and small differences in language use. So I'm also a PhD student, but I'm at Lunds University, an experimental social psychologist, which is more different than you might expect from an experimental psychologist. But yeah, so you're going to hear again about conditions and groups and comparisons here. So connecting a little bit to, again, that the theme of this year's Pride is the key to freedom, as you mentioned. One way that the freedom of gender and sexual minority groups is hindered is through the experience of discrimination, of course. And that can occur in multiple areas of life, in your education, your housing, healthcare, and labor market, which is what I'm focusing on today. And specifically, I want to focus on the initial recruitment situation, so how you get even into getting a job, which then of course leads you to getting a salary, which is excellent for your physical and psychological health. So I first wanted to present just some raw numbers. They're very tiny there, but I'm going to mention them vocally as well. So from the latest data from the EU, this is 2019 in the EU, they found that 21% of the surveyed LGBTI individuals that they asked had experienced during the last year only workplace discrimination. And when looking specifically at trans people within those 21%, that goes up to 35% just within the last year. And then going beyond that, well, before that, and looking at the recruitment situation, 10% reported that during the last year, when they've been looking for work, they have experienced discrimination. And this is, the numbers for Sweden is smaller than for the EU at large. We're at 14 and 5% respectively, compared to these 21 and 10. But studies of recruitment discrimination in Sweden as well do find this, that you have a lower chance of getting a call back compared to comparable heterosexual resumes when you do these sending out fake resume studies. And that's connecting a bit to measurement, as you mentioned. If you sort of don't get a call back or you don't get the job, you're not going to show up in these discrimination statistics either, which is why they might be a low ball, because the people experiencing the most discrimination is probably not going to be sort of in the labor market. They're outside to begin with. But this is what we call direct discrimination. It's when somebody is directly disadvantaged due to their membership in a social group. But we don't even need sort of this direct discrimination to keep groups off of the labor market and keep them away from all these advantages that come from having material resources. So coming back to language use, you can see that before you even think of applying for a job, or even when you're looking for something, you will read some form of organization communication. Regardless of what job you're applying for or what sector you're in, you're going to read some form of communication from that organization. And the language that that organization includes in their communication to potential applicants can have huge effects on who is willing to apply. We've seen that in specifically previous studies on how gendered language can deter women from applying to jobs that are described using stereotypically very masculine, or described using language that sort of connects to the male stereotype. Studies have found that that can deter women from even wanting to apply. Similarly, communication doesn't even have to be using language, it can be visual. We've seen similarly that a lack of visual representation of ethnic minorities in sort of images of who works in a company can act to deter ethnic minority members from applying to that organization. And why is that then? Well, it's because we're very good as people at looking for these social identity contingency signals. So we're always looking for cues that tell us, in this situation, how am I likely to be treated? How are other members with the similar social identities to me, how are they treated in this situation? If I don't see any ethnic minority members in this organization, will I be welcomed? Will I be treated well? Maybe no, you say, and then I won't apply here. And members of social groups that have experiences with stigmatization or marginalization tend to be extra vigilant for looking for these cues, of course, because the cost of accidentally entering a hostile environment can be very, very high. But they're not alone in it. People that belong to higher social status groups also look for these cues of, will I be valued? Will I be valued for who I am as an individual? Because we all look for these signals as individuals. And one place, oh yeah, I should mention that there are in fact studies that show that when organizations use inclusive language, so for instance, I'm going to give an example later, mention some sort of equality initiative or something, members of more overrepresented groups in an organization, so for instance, if it's a male-dominated company, then overrepresented here means men that are looking to apply, that they can feel threatened by this inclusive language because then they get scared that they're not going to get valued, which can be important to remember for later in this presentation. But one place where organizations do directly communicate how will people get treated here is in what is called an equal employment opportunity statement, which has become more and more common, which is, you probably recognize and you've probably seen them. It's where an organization says, we commit to treat all employees and applicants the same, regardless of their age, gender, ethnicity, all of the discrimination bases in Swedish law, all the 7. I've got a couple of examples of how that can look in Swedish, though, because I picked the most Swedish companies I could imagine. I picked Volvo and IKEA. Just to illustrate that these can be phrased in slightly different ways. You can see Volvo phrases their communication around increasing the number of women leaders in the organization, as well as leaders with international backgrounds, whereas IKEA focuses on building an inclusive working environment. Overall, they do not mention any specific groups that would be benefited from this inclusive environment. And it is this sort of difference in language that we wanted to examine. What happens then as a potential applicant? So what we did was see what happens if we introduced some gender trouble into these EO statements. So gender trouble in this very academic sense sort of refers to all acts that reveal gender to be what we call a performative rather than a natural category. Just natural in this sense, meaning that it's not inevitable, as you mentioned. It's not something we just happen upon in nature and then we can say this is a stone and it's this tall, etc. But it's something that is done through our sort of engagement, all of us, even if we want to be in it or out it, we engage in some way with roles and norms and etc. And the troubling part that we did here was that we included language that introduced context-based gender trouble, which is also, again, a fancy way of saying that we tested what happens if we have language that either says gender is not binary, or we have language that says gender is not important, because part of treating gender as a natural category is also treating it as important in all contexts. But then you can say, no, it's not in this. Oops, went too fast. Yeah, so we had 2 online experiments to study how attractive as an employer an organization would be with some different languages in their EO statements, as well as how gender diverse people thought their staff was in terms of, do they employ people who look non-conformative at all? So we did these experiments both in Sweden and in the US. The participants from Sweden were mainly, almost exclusively, people who self-identified themselves as women or men. But in the US sample, we specifically targeted recruiting what we here a bit sloppily call gender minority and gender majority participants, which simply means that we had a recruitment site that had already let participants answer what their gender identity is from a bunch of options. And then 2 of those options that the site had was female and male. We took those and we called them, in this instance, the gender majority. And then they also had answer options that was gender queer, gender non-conforming. They had trans female, trans woman as one option, trans male, trans man into one option. And we took all of the participants who answered one of those, and we took them into the category that we here call gender minority, to sort of see if people, if your placement in relation to the gender binary influence how you're affected by the language. So we had participants read 1 out of 4 descriptions out of a nameless organization. I think it was called Organization Incorporated or something. But what we did was we varied the language. So we had a control condition again, where it simply states that, oh, this is a pleasant place to work at, and it didn't mention gender. Then we had a binary EO statement, where it says that the organization wants to be an equitable workplace for equality between men and women. And then we had an identity inclusive or multi-gender condition, where these are just sort of extractions from the EO statements. They're a little bit longer than this, but so where it states that the organization works with equality between women, men, and individuals with a non-binary or other sort of gender identities. And then we had what is called an identity blind gender ideology. So it's the degendered one, where they simply say, similar to what IKEA did, that everybody has an equal opportunity here and we don't care about gender. So the inclusive one sort of says, we see you and we welcome you for who you are. And the identity blind one says, we will only look at your merits. So we had some ideas that might be differently attractive to different people, that sort of focus on blindness or inclusiveness. So what we did then was we measured how attractive the organization was as an employee, I said, and then we let them pick from some pictures who they thought worked in there. And just without too many numbers or something, the graphs are mostly there to be colorful. So in what is called Study 1A, the Swedish study, which was again just what we call the gender majority people, there were really no difference between the conditions. So there was nobody who was really threatened by explicitly including gender minorities. It's not that they particularly liked it more, they just didn't really care. Which is in contrast to some previous research, as I mentioned. And that was the same pattern really in the US study for, again, the gender majority participants. They didn't really seem to care. They found the organization equally attractive as an employer. But when we look at what we've called the gender minority participants in the US sample, that's where we see the difference. We see that these people, when there was either no mention of gender, or when there was a mention only of binary gender, they believed that they were at greater risk of being discriminated against in this organization, and therefore they found it to be a less attractive employer. They were less likely to apply to work here, compared to the multi-gendered or degendered one, where again, everybody was quite likely to apply. And in both studies, we found that an organization was believed to have a more diverse staff body if they had especially a multi-gendered EO statement. So participants believed that the company put their money where their mouth is, and if they said they were inclusive, they did actually hire people with a gender non-conforming gender expression. So, yeah, I'll lock it up. Sorry. So yeah, basically these small language changes did have an effect for at least people who tend to be more vigilant towards these cues. So in contrast to this, no, we can't explicitly mention minority groups because it might threaten the high status groups. It didn't. It's very possible to do, and especially if you do want to attract a broader pool of applicants, you probably should. But it is, of course, important to put, again, your money where your mouth is. You can't have a discrepancy between saying that you're inclusive and then not being so, because that will only lead to worse outcomes. So thank you. And if you want to read more at your own time, we have a website called genderfair.se, where you can find, I think you can find these slides afterwards and some more information on the research that the entire research group does. So yes, that's me.
Thank you very much. I think maybe if we stand here close to the table, then we'll be for our online audience as well. Thank you very much for these interesting presentations. I mean, these are very short ones, but what I at least take from this is that language matters. And from your research, we saw that just like changing the task, the writing task, it changes the results of what the participants do. And Amanda's research showed that the equal opportunity statements have an impact on who even applies to jobs at different organizations, which I think is important for all of us to take in us, regardless of what kind of organization we work at. But now I'd like to open the floor for questions. Are there any questions here in the audience? Here we have one already. So I will ask you to speak in the mic. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a question for both of you. So what would your next study be if you got funding to do a new study?
That is an excellent question. I think I can,
Yeah,
because I do have some plans. But yeah, the next study in this line of research for me would be to try to make it a little bit more applied, to make it more as the actual sort of job application situation is, because we don't apply to organization incorporated. We apply to Volvo or IKEA or to Skansa or wherever you apply. So that would be something I would like to do. If I had access to all the information in the world, I would like to look at what kind of applications these corporations actually get in, and if it matters and differs based on the language they use. But that one is a tricky one, as you mentioned, because measurement again, you're not going to measure the ones who don't apply because you don't know what their thoughts were. But yeah, that's something that I would like to do.
Yeah, and I kind of want to continue going really both of the two tracks that I just mentioned. So one, I want to continue making gender trouble, as you put it. And so really we, as you saw, or the first sort of hen, I call it intervention, where people use hen. That's a pretty subtle thing to do, actually. And so I kind of want to explore more other ways we can kind of challenge the idea of binary gender for people, and seeing if a more powerful way to do that has a larger effect. And also just want to keep exploring, just keep showing that, if you're measuring gender in different ways, you're going to get these really wildly different results. Because the field of face perception I think it really needs to kind of reckon with that. But I don't have any concrete ideas about that yet.
Thank you. Do we have any more audience questions at this time? Otherwise, I could ask, in Sweden, there have in recent years been several different discussions relating to trans issues. For instance, young trans people's access to gender-affirming care, question of if trans rights would somehow be a threat to women's rights, and those kinds of issues. And I'm wondering, have you or your colleagues in the research that you do on the gender binary in different ways, what do you feel that your research can contribute to these discussions that are going on in Sweden?
Do you want to start?
I can start. I started last time, but if you want to. Yeah. No, but I think, because I haven't really done research on that topic, but I think similar to what I mentioned about the recruitment discrimination, what we could see there that was, again, a little bit in contrast to what previous research has found, it is that if you simply mention that, okay, we want to make it better for more groups of people, it's not necessarily the case that you're going to scare away the people that are used to being the norm. You could actually do that, which means that's what I think connects a little bit to the issue you brought up of this creation of a conflict between sort of women's rights and trans rights, as if there weren't women in trans rights. Those aren't dichotomies to begin with. But that the phrasing of how, again, just as I did now, you can rephrase the issue using language of not saying these are two separate groups competing to get these rights, but you can phrase it as these are two groups with a joint purpose, or maybe sometimes different purpose, but again, not two separate groups, because they do overlap, of course. So that's, I think, a little something that comes from that research, that you can actually explicitly include many groups, and the way you talk about groups matters for how they are perceived.
Yeah, I think my research is less sort of directly impactful to that, but I do think that there is a way in which, I think especially transphobes talk about like biological gender and kind of have a sort of a, I don't want to say scientific, but kind of like a science glorifying point of view, or like a science, I think scientism is a word that's been thrown around. And I think the work that I do really challenges the idea of kind of like any sort of measurement as being uncomplicated, and just like like looking at like, well, there's two big kinds, but like that really depends on how you measure, how you, like what you're, the ways you're looking at it. And so I think that's illustrative for that, and kind of the dangers of being too I don't want to say too reliant on science, but like not like uncritically accepting certain scientific results.
From this, I'm also thinking, I mean, now the topic here today is on the one hand language and on the one hand gender. And these are topics that are delved into in lots of different research or scientific fields. I'm thinking sociology and linguistics, for instance. But you both study psychology. What do you feel psychology brings to this discussion that's sort of unique compared to other disciplines?
Oh, that's a really good question.
That's a good question. That is one that should probably go home and reflect
Yeah.
on as well. It's an excellent one. In a way, I think psychology brings both what is its weakness and what can be a strength, and that is the focus on sort of the individual experience, which of course sociology can do as well. But they have their strength of having a more macro focus, which is really good, of course, but and psychology can tend to be a little bit too focused on the individual, but that can also be good because the macro is of course made up of the individuals. So yeah, a reminder maybe psychology brings that when we talk about language change, we're talking about actual people that make choices about what words to use in contexts.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something as well, which is the idea of like, of looking at the individual and really looking at the process, like looking at what is actually happening, what is the mechanism, what's going on in the brain. And I think it really is an important pitfall to be aware of, that like being too focused on the process and the individual misses the wider systemic influences. But I do think that at the same time, I feel like just knowing the how for the individual, I think that's an important contribution that psychology can make.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question from the audience. We have one who's already asked one question, but if there are no other takers, then going once, going twice, going to you.
Thank you. So this is a question for Ellie. Do you think your research has any implications for artificial intelligence's facial recognition and classification of genders? Because I presume that those are based on training data where humans have labeled men and women. So do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think it really does. Again, so I'm really focused on kind of the human perspective, but there's a really, you can look at kind of what is happening in the face, and what features of a face actually get characterized as female, feminine, masculine, I think that what really I'm thinking a lot about, I don't know if this is actually my research, but I'm thinking a lot about is how often in these kind of, the way that this is done is usually when you like train an AI to do something. The way that this is done is you're taking an average of a bunch of women, really, and an average of a bunch of men, and you're saying, well, you're kind of like drawing a line between those two and saying that this is what femininity and masculinity is. And I think what that's doing is kind of just relying on this arbitrary, again, this assumption that gender is binary, but while at the same time really recreating a gender binary. But it's by definition creating a system where masculinity and femininity, as you're defining it, are opposites. And so that is pretty complex, but I think if anything, my research can show maybe like raise awareness of that, like the artificialness of those kinds of measurements. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think that was maybe a quite good point to end with, the whole artificialness of or artifice of all of this, because these are, when it comes to gender, these are social constructs. And I guess what I would take from this seminar is that, but representation matters. Like you, Amanda, said, it's also in your presentation, it's not just about language, but also about pictures and like seeing like who actually works here or who do we want to invite to our organizations. And that's something that we all have responsibility to do, creating these inclusive environments where everyone feels welcome and everyone gets space to speak up. Thank you so much to Ellie and Amanda for participating in the seminar. Thank you to everyone here who's listening, both in the room and online. Also, again, thank you to my colleagues in Academic Pride. And the slides will be available at thegenderfair.se. And I guess maybe that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.